We have some time for Q&A, and so we'd like to open the floor. I've been asked that we kindly request that you keep the questions brief because I'm sure there are many questions. So we'll start right back there. So we have a microphone circulating. The question is, where did the name the Marcel Network come from?
When Moussa went to see the bishop and got agreement to set up an office in the bishop's residence and start producing false documents and get this thing organized, the bishop asked him, he said, you're going to have to take a clandestine name. What would you like as a clandestine name? And Moussa said, Monsieur Marcel. And the bishop said, Marcel what? And Moussa said, just Marcel. And thus the Marcel Network was born.
We have a few up here.
I have a loud stentorian voice. Fred, one assumes that the Gestapo, which was a cunning organization as well as a very efficient one, must have rounded up some others besides these 527. Weren't there some who were actually taken from their convents, or when they went out to school or went out for some other purpose?
There were children and parents who were arrested constantly. The Marcel Network had an incredible record. As far as is known, only 2 children were captured and perished. There was a priest in a mountain village who bragged that he had 2 children hidden, and somehow an informer got hold of this information and told the Gestapo, and these 2 boys, the Gartner boys, were arrested and eventually died at Auschwitz. Odette happened to be on a bus going back from a visit to other hidden children, and she saw these 2 boys on the bus. And at first she thought they had run away from the mountain village where they had been placed. And then when she got up in the bus to approach them, to scold them, she realized that they were under arrest. And one of the boys had waved to her and said, go away. Odette happened to be arrested 2 days after that incident. And one of the things that may have contributed to her arrest was standing up in that bus. It's possible that the Gestapo officers saw her and followed her home. We don't know. In any event, those 2 boys were lost. And at the end of the war, there was a very moving passage in Moussa's diary, because Mr. Gartner, the father of those 2 boys, came to visit Moussa in his office and said that he had survived Auschwitz. He had survived the cold. He had survived the beatings. He had survived all the deportations, living for the day when he could rejoin his sons. And Moussa was speechless. He didn't know what to tell this man. And after a long silence, the man understood, and he asked what happened to his son. Moussa explained, and there was another long silence. And then Mr. Gartner said, thank you for saving Moussa explained what he had done, saving other children. Mr. Gartner said, thank you for saving the others, and thank you for trying to save mine, and left a broken man. And Moussa wrote in his diary, Monsieur Gartner, forgive me. So there was that incident, and then of course it is possible that incident led to Odette's arrest. Now there were a number of very close incidents where both the Abadis narrowly escaped arrest. A number of the children escaped arrest, but they managed, once they got these kids into the convents under assumed names and false documents. Fortunately, there were no arrests from inside the convents or the boarding schools, and in fact the children were really prisoners inside those convents. I mean, the girls could not go out on weekends for fear that they would be arrested. They were inside the walls of the convents with these very dour nuns. It was a very difficult life, but at least they were saved.
Perhaps you could say a few words about what happened to Odette after she was arrested.
Okay. Odette was arrested and was shipped to Auschwitz. Because she was a doctor, she was in a relatively privileged position where The room the barracks where she was living were actually heated. The diet was a little bit better, so her chances of survival were better. And because she was a doctor, she had more freedom of movement around the camp than other prisoners. She actually assisted in these terrible selection processes where Mengele picked the victims for his experiments. She tried to save people anyway. She watched him make the selection process. She was able to visit the dormitory where they had only dwarfs, the dormitory where they had only twins. She was able to visit, after women were selected, they were taken to a special barracks and held overnight before they were sent to the gas station, the gas chambers. And she had these terrible visits with women who knew that this was their last night on earth, and she had to try and calm them and promise to talk to their relatives. And she witnessed these terrible things. The last thing, when these women were cleared out and taken to the gas chambers, the barracks were covered with little slices of bread, and the most valuable thing these people had was their extra bread rations. They left them on the. She saw incredible things, and she wrote a very valuable book in French about her experience at Auschwitz, which unfortunately has never been translated into English, but is a remarkable document because, unlike other survivors at Auschwitz, she saw many things that other people hadn't seen. And there was one description in her book that I will never forget. She was sitting on a step on her barracks crying. And another woman came up to her and said to her, "Why are you crying?" And she said, "I'm thinking about the children." And the woman said, "Are you married?" And Odette said no, because at that stage she had not yet married Moussa. And the woman said, "Well, how many children do you have?" And she said, 500. Voila.
Further questions? We have one in the excuse me.
Yes, I want to say that I was a hidden child, and I'm a Holocaust survivor from France. And I just finished my book of survival. And I want to say that there were indeed some wonderful French people, otherwise I wouldn't be alive. I survived with my sister and my parents, but everybody else died in Sobibor and Auschwitz. And we were supposed to go to a convent. I mean, we were in Paris during the big roundup, and they forgot to ring our bell. But they came 2 weeks after we fled, and we crossed the demarcation line, and my parents were arrested and detained. But the préfet of Dordogne, where it was apparently a semi-good man, and he sent us, instead of to a camp, he sent us to a un trou, as my father said, the little place where we were allowed to hide. And the mayor and the farmer, there were 30 houses, and they were wonderful people. And 2 years ago, the village was honored, and there is a plaque, completely anonymous, but saying that this is one of the villages in France where they saved, to the risk of their lives, Jewish families, and they prevented them from ending in the death camps. And I'm working on getting the mayor to be one of the righteous now, which is not an easy thing to do, but I hope I will succeed. That's what I wanted to say.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions up front when you're... we have an immediate question, and then we have one...
I'm sorry, which village in French is that? Quel village en France? D'accord.
And we have another question right here. Merci.
Mr. Coleman, you mentioned that Odette was in Auschwitz for 1 year. How was she freed? How did she survive?
Well, as I say, she was in a more privileged position as a doctor and had a better diet. Actually, she was there for the last year. And in fact, I mean, there was a little more than that, because as the Soviets advanced west into Poland, the Germans transferred prisoners from Auschwitz closer into Germany. She ended up in Belsen, and she was actually in Belsen, where she survived typhoid, by the way. As the Allies neared the camps, and the Russians actually were coming in, and from one side, and the British, the Americans from the other, the slaughter continued. And one day she, in April of 45, she was exhausted from her rounds, and she ordered everybody to leave her alone, and went to sleep. And in the afternoon, and some very excited woman came in and said, you know, the British are coming. And Odette replied, you know, go back to sleep and dream of Santa Claus. But they in fact were. And the British arrived at the camp, and there was this on the mic, on loudspeakers, good morning, people, you are free. And they rushed. The Germans had abandoned the camp. And the British came in and tried, first of all, to feed these people. And they couldn't. Had been on such starvation diets they couldn't really take the food, so they had to be given very liquid type diets until they finally recovered and so on. And in fact, Odette remained in the camp after the liberation for a couple of months to aid with the rehabilitation of the various prisoners, and then finally went back to Paris. Well, I wouldn't say he had no problem. And in fact, I mean, one of the interesting questions was who suffered more in this. She obviously suffered in the camps. I mean, she had deprivation, she was beaten, and so on. He was desperately worried about her. And he had also the psychological effects of dealing with these children and trying to reunite them with the family and so on. And after the war, he fell into the depression, not her. And she talked about how in some ways it was more difficult for the person outside than the one who was in the camp. She was clearly the stronger person.
One of the things that's so interesting in the book is that Moussa is described in very three-dimensional terms. And so maybe you could give a bit of a picture of just a portrait of him as with, you know, because with the temper and his strong-willed, et cetera, et cetera.
Yes, well, Moussa, I think, is fairly described as a high-maintenance friend. He had an extremely strong will, and there are numerous examples in his life about how well, there was one case, for example, where a young actor had befriended Moussa and invited Moussa to a dress rehearsal of a play, and afterwards said, how was I? And Moussa said, well, you started out pretty well, but then you weren't so good, and then you were a little better. And the guy did not appreciate the criticism. He said, look, you know, this is a dress rehearsal. You could have given me a little more confidence before I go on. And Moussa would not accept the tone from this guy, and he said, I can't tell you anything, and totally dropped him and never saw him again for the rest of his life. I mean, he was that kind of character. He had a very difficult time with these little children. He was trying to get them to accept their new names, their non-Jewish names, and these cover stories so they could be saved. And often it took quite a while, and the children were difficult, and he lost his patience, and he would scream at them. Okay, this is not very nice. He had a temper. One of the things that I try to show in this book is that, you know, yes, he was heroic, but he was far from perfect. He had problems like all other human beings. But I think the key thing that helped him throughout the war and his ability to pull off the Marcel Network was this incredible willpower, just tunnel vision. I have to do that no matter what. And that was the sort of thing that eventually offended friends in later life, but it got him through what counted.
Julien said that there were 4 children that kept in touch with the Abadis after the war. I'm wondering, did more afterwards discover that they had not known the story, like Julien's story, and then eventually got in touch with them, and we know where they are?
Well, most of the children who were saved by the Abadis were very young and never knew, as in Julian's story, who the people were, and never knew the Abadis, and were not able to meet them afterwards. In fact, Odette discouraged contacts with former children who tried to, when they discovered who these people were, there were a number of occasions where people tried to get hold of the Abadis and see them again, and it was such an emotional strain on Moussa. It took 48 hours to recover every time he met one of these people. And it was also a strain on her that she rather discouraged it. And the people who did maintain a relationship with them, there were 2 people. One woman who maintained contact with them from the end of the war continuously. And she was probably their closest friend, who is still today the executor of their estates and their estate and the keeper of their archives. And the second woman, Françoise Baum, who was here. Oh, there she is. Hello, nice to see you. I want to talk to you later. She moved to the United States, but she kept up a relationship for 30 years with them by mail. So these were 2 examples. Julian, who met the Abadis later on in life through Lucien Lazare. And then there was another woman and another man who knew the Abadis through other circumstances. And for the purposes of this book, I restricted my interviews to 6 former children, 3 boys and 3 girls, all of whom knew the Abadis. But they were very rare, and that was the group that I could find that could give one some insight to what these people were really like. The others really never knew them.
Perhaps a question for Julien. Julien, could you tell us a little bit about daily life in the children's home?
Well, as I said, paradoxically, given the circumstances, wartime, and desperate situation of the Jewish people in France and elsewhere, these were very happy years for us because it was a camp, a children's home rather, run on, the people who founded were young and full of vigor and bright ideas, very progressive in their outlook about handling children who, for the most part, were children who had either been abandoned by their parents or orphaned or determined by French law, or their parents determined by French law as to be unfit to retain direct responsibility for them. So they had been removed from their parents by judicial act. But there were a lot of babies, incidentally, at least of the average 50 to 70 children there at any time. Fully 1/4 were babies abandoned virtually at birth. This is a time before contraception and various other means of controlling that situation, and so there were a lot of children abandoned and collected by other institutions as well, the Assistance Publique being one of them. But the Rayon du Soleil was one of the few private homes engaged significantly in that kind of work. And so we also, I should add, happened to be very privileged in the kind of quarters we were living in. For the first 2 years out of the 3 that I was there, we lived in a grand villa, huge villa, owned by Americans who left it in 1940 at the time of the armistice, and entrusted the villa to the forts to be used as they best saw fit, obviously as a home for the children that they cared for. So we were there on the hills overlooking Cannes, a garden of 4 hectares, which is what, about 8 acres or so, manicured gardens. About a mile, not even from the center of town, living a very sheltered life, and on this large estate, divorced largely from what was happening outside. The media then weren't at all even under occupation what they might have become since, and so we were literally closed off from the world at large. And I was in good fortune of having been determined to be fit for secondary studies, classical secondary studies. And so the last 2 years I was there, I was a student at the lycée and did nearly 2 years, 1 3/4, 6e and 5e, to those who are familiar with the system there, and led a relatively normal life. But I was the only one of the, let's say on the average 60, 70 children who followed that particular program of studies. All of the others were destined for more vocational type training in various other establishments of the city. So we came away obviously bereft of our parents, and with all of the psychological and consequences that this may have had, but having in fact lived in France at a very trying time in very sheltered conditions with a family that was absolutely superb, and as I've said before, became and remained my family in France.
What about the food? Did you ever feel that there was starvation, or where was your next meal, or that you were protected that way?
Again, because it was a children's home and they had a network of relations extending up country of very considerable size, they had access to food that probably the general population didn't have. But even so, there were times when, in fact, it got to be rather thin. But fortunately, not for very long.
He's really the exception. I mean, the problem in France in wartime is you had to have ration cards to get food. And the Abadis could put children in Catholic homes, in Catholic convents or in Protestant families, but they had to be fed. And the only way they could be fed is to get ration cards. And how do you get ration cards? I mean, it's very, very difficult. Moussa went to the local authorities in Nice and met a very brave man who was willing to take some chances. But even that was limited. And originally Moussa said to this guy that he wanted them to falsify ration cards for him, and they told him that was a crime punishable by death. So he said, okay, well, will you give me blank ration cards and let me falsify them, but on official card, on official forms. And even that was a problem because all the forms were numbered. Say Moussa got form number 1050 to form 4050. And somehow the police would discover that these numbers were missing. The official who gave him the card said, if that happens, we'll have to tell them that you stole them. And Moussa said, fine, he took the deal. He didn't have any choice. So that's how they got fed.
A question in the back.
Could you make any general comments about to what degree the French police were turning a blind eye to what was going on with respect to hiding Jewish children, or to what degree they were fairly vigilant in making arrests and reporting information?
Okay, the Vichy government had a special police force known as the milice that had its own uniforms, often recruited from thugs, criminals, that did the dirty work on the rounding up of Jews. The regular police force was a little different, and sometimes you had exceptions where people actually helped. I think one of the great examples, what happened in Julian's case, in fact, the reason that he's with us today, he and his brother were among the last children who were not deported with their parents. At the time that Julian and his family was at this internment camp in southwest of France, the Vichy government was just deporting the parents, but not the children. The children were being turned over to social agencies, and the rule changed, and the Vichy government decided that children should be deported with their parents to the death camps, and the notice arrived to the official who was responsible for this particular area, saying that from now on, the children should be deported with the parents, and this official, at great risk, delayed the implementation of that policy change for 2 months. And it was during this 2-month period that Julian and his brother were released.
Andrew, I may add one other incident from personal experience preceding the period we're talking about here, namely August 1942, 26th of August precisely, when a large roundup, very similar in character and spirit to the one that took place in Paris 2 months earlier, the famous roundup of the Velodrome d'Hiver, Veldiv, took place. The counterpart that I'm speaking of, 2 months later in Nice. Nice was then the haven to thousands of Jews from pretty much all over occupied Europe that had found their way there. Mostly of foreign origin, but many of them French nationals as well. And in the days immediately preceding the roundup, rumors started floating about the Jewish community, and they were deliberate, in other words, leaks, not rumors, but leaks from the Commissariat de Police de Nice. And there were several individuals who were later recognized and duly noted for having deliberately leaked the word out, a word that spread pretty rapidly throughout the refugee community and resulted in many of them, including my own family, being saved. In our case, we were living in an apartment building. Incidentally, we all were registered at the police. They had our address and so forth. And the apartment immediately above ours was empty, and my father somehow had managed to gain access to it. And the fateful night of August 26th, we just went one flight up to the apartment, spent the night there, but duly in the course of the night, we heard people entering the apartment below ours. And after a while, finding no one, departing. But that's the event that convinced my parents that they couldn't stay in France any longer, and led them then to plan an exit to Switzerland, which failed.
Time for one more question? I have one, and we'll end on that. Could you tell us a bit more about Bishop Raymond, his first meeting with Moussa?
All right, Moussa grew up in the Jewish ghetto in Damascus. And in those days, school ended in secondary school. But exceptionally, his family allowed him to continue his education by going into the city and being given a higher education by French Catholic priests. They weren't afraid that somehow this experience would turn their Jewish son into a Catholic. So he learned French, and he learned his love of books from this Catholic education, which eventually led him to a scholarship in France and eventually to graduate studies. And he was doing a PhD thesis on the medieval French theater, which essentially is Catholic Bible stories. So Moussa was very well versed in Catholic lore personally. And when he began thinking about forming the Marcel Network, to him, because of the cooperation between the Catholic Church and Vichy and the Germans, he believed that the Catholic Church was beyond suspicion for the Germans, and therefore he decided to start with the Catholic Church, knowing from personal experience that the church was full of men of goodwill, and knowing from personal experience that if he could hide children in Catholic convents and boarding schools, they would not be turned into Catholics. So he also had the fortunate experience he had when he arrived in Nice and he was unemployed. He found that another refugee in Nice had been his faculty advisor in Paris, and his faculty advisor was a great luminary in French intellectual circles who used to lecture about the French medieval theater to make a living in the south of France, and he employed Moussa to act out some of the scenes in these lectures. And one day Bishop Raymond came to one of these lectures, which Moussa thought took a lot of courage given the attitude of the Pope and the atmosphere of the day. And he briefly met Raymond, but obviously Raymond would not remember him and know him. So when he decided that he, as a modest nobody, wanted an appointment with a high official of the Catholic Church, he asked a Jesuit priest he knew to introduce him and make the appointment with Raymond. And Raymond decided to receive him in his residence on a hilltop in Nice. At the time, Bishop Raymond was about 70 years old and was a man of extraordinary courage. He had been a combat officer, not a chaplain, but a combat officer in World War I, highly decorated. And Moussa did not really know all this background. He went in to see him. He said, "I am not of your religion. I am not of your faith. I'm very different from you, but I need your help at the risk of your life." And the bishop said, "You know, what do you want me to do at the risk of my life?" And Moussa said, "Only to help save the children." And he was hitting all the right notes. He didn't realize this, but the bishop was very concerned about the fate of Jewish children. And so at the end of their conversation, the bishop asked him, "Will you carry arms in your work?" And Moussa said no, he would never carry arms. And the bishop said, "All right, I will consider your proposition. Come back to me in 48 hours, and I think you've converted me, but I need to think about it." And the bishop used those 48 hours to consult with his senior aides, because if he agreed to take in the risk of helping Moussa, they too would be vulnerable. Their lives would be at stake. He wanted to weigh the effect, the risks on the diocese and all the rest of it. But he did get the approval of his colleagues, and when Moussa came back, the bishop told him, it is my duty to help you save children, and you can have an office here." And Moussa actually had an office in the bishop's residence, which he used to forge documents in the bishop's residence. The bishop would sometimes come down at night and help him forge these documents. And Moussa said to the bishop, you're crazy. Your handwriting is known all over the diocese. You'll be found out. You'll be arrested. You'll be shot." And the bishop said, "Well, then we'll go to heaven together, and you're not such bad company."
Thank you, Mr. Coleman and Julien, very much.